If you're trying to become a better runner, it seems logical to look at what the best runners in the world are doing and copy that. After all, elite athletes are the gold standard. So if they can run a certain amount of mileage, structure their workouts a certain way, and train with a certain intensity, shouldn't we do the same? This is exactly where a lot of runners get stuck. Because elite training works for elite athletes, but the reasons it works are often misunderstood. And if you copy those training plans without understanding why they work, you can easily end up exhausted, injured, or completely stuck. And I know this because I have made almost every training mistake myself. I also see runners make this mistake every single week as a coach. So in this video, I want to explain 3 realities of endurance physiology that show why copying elite training often backfires and what recreational runners should do instead. If you're new here, my name is Caroline. I'm a running coach, and over the last few years, I've coached more than 100 runners, from beginners all the way to sub 3-hour marathoners. And my own running journey started very small. I began running less than 20 kilometers per week, and over time, I've built up to 130-kilometer training weeks while pursuing my Olympic marathon dream. I'm also slightly obsessed with training data and research. So in this video, I'm combining my coaching experience, my personal running journey, and research on endurance physiology to explain why elite training doesn't translate directly to recreational runners. Before we go further, there is one idea I want you to remember throughout this entire video. Elite training works because it's individualized to elite athletes. Their physiology, their recovery capacity, and their training intensity allow them to handle that type of training. But when a completely different runner tries to copy the same plan, the training is no longer individualized. And that's when problems start appearing. Once you understand that, training becomes much easier to think about. Because the real question isn't what do elites do? The real question is what training does my body respond to? The effort is not the same. The first reality that makes elite training hard to copy is that the effort is not the same. So even when the pace might look easy, you may have heard of the famous 80-20 rule studied by endurance researcher Stephen Saylor. When scientists analyze how elite endurance athletes train, they find that roughly 80% of training happens at low intensity and about 20% at moderate or high intensity. But here's the part that often gets misunderstood. Elite athletes have spent many years building an extremely strong aerobic system. Their hearts are incredibly efficient, so even when they're running with a low heart rate relative to their max, their pace is fast, their lactate levels stay low, and the recovery cost of that run is relatively small. For recreational runners, that's usually not the case. Even if you slow the pace down significantly, the effort level can still be relatively high, and you can see that clearly in heart rate. Your heart rate climbs quickly because your aerobic system is still developing. And that is something I see constantly as a coach. And many runners look at the pace charts online that tell them what their easy pace should be based on race results, but those charts only really hold true once the aerobic system is developed enough. And for many runners, the effort required to hold those paces is still too high. So what should be an easy run quietly becomes a moderate effort run. And moderate effort training has a much higher recovery cost. And this is exactly why good training always has to be individualized to the runner's current physiology, which means you can't accumulate the same training volume. And that's one of the biggest reasons many runners feel constantly tired, even when they believe they're following the right training advice. And that difference in physiological effort creates another problem most runners don't think about. Because when your aerobic system is less developed, you naturally run slower paces. And slower paces mean you spend more time under stress for the same distance, which brings us to the second reality. Your body understands time, not distance. The second reason elite training is difficult to copy is that your body does not actually understand distance. Your watch measures kilometers or miles, but your body measures stress. And one of the biggest drivers of stress is time under load. So let's take a realistic example. An elite marathon runner might run their easy runs around 4:15 per kilometer. I know that's crazy. A recreational runner might run closer to 6:30 per kilometer. If both runners go out for 20 kilometers, the elite runner finishes in about an hour and 25 minutes, but the recreational runner might be out there for over 2 hours. That's roughly 40 to 50 minutes more time under stress for the same distance. And that difference matters because your body is responding to the duration of the stress, not just a number on your watch. And this is one of the reasons I personally prefer measuring training using time on feet instead of distance. Time reflects the true physiological load of the run. It also levels out the playing field. It doesn't penalize slower runners, and it makes training much easier to adjust when fitness fluctuates. For example, if you're coming back from injury or after a break, distance-based training can push you far too quickly, but time-based training allows you to rebuild gradually. And this isn't just a coaching observation. Research on running injuries has also looked closely at how training load relates to injury risk. So, for example, a systematic review by Nielsen and colleagues in the British Journal of Sports Medicine examined common training errors linked to running injuries. And one of their conclusions was that increase in training load and exposure are important risk factors for injury. Another review by Damstead and colleagues found that sudden increases in training load appears to increase running injury risk. So while we don't know the perfect mileage for every runner, we do know that when exposure to stress rises too quickly, injury risk increases. And this is exactly what can happen when slower runners copy elite mileage. And this was actually a big lesson for me personally. Earlier in my running career, I had a very strong work harder mindset. I believed more distance automatically meant more progress, and that mindset eventually contributed to me having 6 stress factors. Learning to respect the actual stress on the body instead of chasing distance numbers completely changed how I train and how I coach today. Recovery capacity is completely different. The third reason you shouldn't copy elite training is that elite athletes don't just train differently, they recover differently. Their entire lifestyle is built around training and recovery. Many elite runners nap during the day, have regular physiotherapy, optimize their nutrition, sleep more, and structure their schedule around recovery. Most recreational runners are balancing work, family, commuting, life responsibilities, and often less sleep. From a physiological perspective, your body actually doesn't distinguish between different types of stress. Training stress, work stress, emotional stress, poor sleep all contribute to what researchers call total stress load. Scientists sometimes refer to this as elastic load, meaning the total amount of stress the body is adapting to. When that load gets too high, the body's stress hormones, especially cortisol, remain elevated for longer periods. And chronically elevated stress hormones interfere with recovery and adaptation. I know, it sucks. Research on overtraining syndrome, including the International Olympic Committee consensus statement by Nielsen and colleagues, shows that performance declines when total stress exceeds the body's ability to recover, which makes perfect sense. So recovery capacity plays a major role in how much training someone can actually handle. And elite athletes can often tolerate much higher training volumes because their entire life supports recovery. For recreational runners, that recovery capacity is usually much lower, which means copying elite training can quickly push runners past the point where adaptation happens. And when that happens, more training doesn't make you better, it just makes you more tired. So, what should recreational runners do instead? Instead of copying elite workouts, we should copy elite principles. Things like controlling intensity, progressively increasing training load, building aerobic capacity, and managing recovery. So, one way I apply this with my athletes is by measuring training in minutes instead of distance, because time reflects the true physiological stress of the run. And another tool I rely heavily on is heart rate training, which, surprise, surprise, if you've been watching any of my other videos. But heart rate training automatically accounts for things like fatigue, sleep, stress, heat, fitness level, even hormones, which is exactly why it's such a powerful tool, especially for recreational runners. Most of us have far more external stress than elite athletes, so having a metric that reflects how the body is actually responding to training is incredibly useful. And that is also why the training plans that I create are built around heart rate and time on feet rather than strict mileage targets. Another important point I want to mention is that most of my advice assumes that runners are already close to their current training capacity, meaning They feel tired, they struggle with injuries, or they feel like they can't handle more running. In those situations, the solution is not adding more intensity. It's improving how the training load is managed. But there is an important exception. If a runner is not limited by fatigue or injuries, and the main constraint is simply time, then the strategy can look different. If you only have a few hours per week to train but recover well, adding a bit more intensity can actually make sense, because intensity becomes a stimulus that drives adaptation when volume is limited. And this is actually one of the first things I look at when I start working with a new athlete. Are they limited by time, or are they limited by recovery capacity? Because those two situations require very different training strategies. And I'll probably dedicate a full video to that topic because it's one of the most common misconceptions in training. So elite runners train the way they do because their bodies have spent years adapting to that level of training. Their physiology, recovery capacity, and lifestyle allows them to handle that load. And most runners don't need to train like elites. They need to train in a way that matches their own physiology, their own recovery capacity, and their own life situation. The real key to progress isn't copying elite plans or really anyone's plan. It's understanding the principles behind training and applying them intelligently to your current level. The idea of individualization is actually the foundation of how I coach runners, and it's also how I've designed the running plans I offer. Instead of one generic plan, there are multiple plans built for different levels because runners start from very different places. And within those plans, the training is guided by heart rate and time on feet so that the effort automatically adjusts to your own physiology. Your pace might change depending on fatigue, hills, or fitness, but your effort stays where it should, which allows your aerobic system to develop without constantly pushing past your recovery capacity. And that's really the goal of good training. Not to train harder, but to train smarter and more sustainably. And if you want to dive deeper into how to control training intensity, I've made an entire playlist explaining heart rate training that I'll link right here. And if this video helped clarify things for you, consider subscribing. Thank you so much for being here.